Who are the criminals that just can't help themselves but do crime over and over? Let's find out, starting with number 5, the wedding crasher. Sandra Lynn Henson has taken up an interesting hobby. She likes to crash weddings and then steal from the guests of those weddings while their focus is elsewhere. She was pretty successful, and despite being in her 50s, she's had a rather splendid 6-year career stealing like this. She's done it in 6 southern states and even went back to doing it after she was arrested and released on bail. Sandra might be old, but she's not looking to retire from her life of crime anytime soon. The crazy thing about Sandra is that her rap sheet is like a mile long, and yet she's never been behind bars for a considerable period of time. In 2019, she was arrested for crashing weddings and stealing stuff, but she got released on bail and simply moved to another jurisdiction to continue her crimes. In fact, in the last 6 years, she's been arrested in Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi, and every time she gets arrested, she finds her way out and continues to crash weddings and steal everything she can get her greedy paws on. At this point, her arrests are just a temporary hold on her career and have no lasting impact on her. The thing about Sandra is that she's no random party crasher. In fact, she's a rather meticulous party crasher. At one wedding she crashed, she waited until the entire party went to the front of the building to hold sparklers for the newlyweds. Once the hall was almost empty, she got to work and even wandered into the bridal room to see what she could nab. That was when the sister of the bride walked in, Cindy Lou Who style, and realized that Sandra was a thief. So the police were called and her vehicle was searched. That's when police discovered a list of weddings and venues she had been to and planned to be at. She even had the names of the bride and groom. She had made a list, checked it twice, and was going to steal from everyone, whether they were naughty or nice. But it hasn't been all parties and thefts for our favorite crasher. In 2017, the police caught her stealing after she made the rookie mistake of being captured on camera. Her case went to trial and she was convicted and put on probation. You'd probably think probation would stop Sandra, or that she would at least lay low for a bit. Well, maybe you would lay low for a bit. That's simply not an option for a superstar criminal like Sandra. 2 years later, in 2019, Sandra got caught doing the same thing once again. This time it was in Alabama, and she was promptly charged with 2 counts of theft. She was caught on camera again and had stolen $500 in cash and gift cards from the gift table. The police later discovered that the same day she had done the same thing at 3 other weddings. In 2021, her trial was finally completed and she was sentenced to a year in prison. Her probation was also revoked. So did Sandra actually end up in prison like you'd expect? Well, yes, but she was released from prison early and was back on the streets. And Sandra only knows how to do 2 things: steal from weddings and, well, that's probably it. It seems like that's all she does is just steal from weddings. Maybe she does something else, but her other talents hardly seem relevant at this point. Thankfully, Sandra has been arrested again, and this time she may actually have to serve out her sentence. Have you ever been to a wedding or crashed one yourself? Tell us about it in the comments below. Number 4, overcharged. Sergey and Galina Lebedenko stole a whopping $34 million from a millionaire Democratic donor by overcharging his Amex. And the incredible thing is, this tycoon didn't notice the millions missing from his checking account until years later. In fact, the victim, 79-year-old Win McCormack, only noticed the massive fraud 7 years into it. The fraud itself was simple. Sergey and Galina started working with McCormack in 2006. McCormack hired their driving service, and over time, Sergey started running daily errands for the multimillionaire. Soon, their relationship grew even further as McCormack hired Sergey and his wife to fix things around his house and even help him house sit. McCormack paid Sergey and his wife through his American Express card. The payments were approved by his bank, and our multimillionaire did very little oversight on his end. This meant that Sergey and his wife could bill McCormack whatever they wanted, and he wouldn't notice. The bank would also pay them out since they believed that the charges were genuine. And that's how the heist started. Very soon, Sergey and his wife started inflating regular bills by hundreds of thousands of dollars. They used the money they got from the theft to fund a lavish lifestyle they could never have afforded on their own. This included a $1.5 million executive jet, a $2 million home in California, a $2.3 million home in Oregon, and other houses in Portland for their adult children and their pastor. That's right, Sergey and Galina are dedicated Christians, and they believed their pastor deserved a house funded by stolen money. Unfortunately for Sergey and his partner, their faith couldn't make them whole. McCormack eventually got wise to the scam and started asking questions. In November of 2023, McCormack started asking hard questions about the figures he was being charged by Sergey. But instead of just denying the charge and stopping the theft like any honest thief would, Sergey denied any wrongdoing, telling McCormack that if he was such a problem, he should be fired. And why do you accuse me of these things? Blah, blah, blah. And then continued stealing all the same. McCormack, who sounds like a surprisingly nice guy, even started pleading with Sergey to stop stealing from him after noticing $300,000 in charges in 2 months. Sergey still denied any wrongdoing and again continued to steal. McCormack even tried to stop the theft by asking Sergey to report his expenses directly to an accountant, but that didn't work either. Eventually, the FBI was alerted and Sergey and his wife were arrested. The police searched their $1 million home and found $100,000 in cash, 150 ounces of gold worth about $300,000, and 12 firearms. Well, the Lebedenkos have now been arrested and are currently awaiting trial. The crazy thing is when McCormack noticed the theft, he actually told Sergey that if he kept up with the stealing, he'd get fired for sure. How's that not automatic termination? Sergey was clearly fraudulently charging McCormack about $500 a day every month, and he just gets a warning? And it wasn't as if he was skimming or something. These two were taking a significant amount of money. Like, if he just said, "Okay, sir," and went from there, they'd still have everything they stole. But greed is the mighty undoer, isn't it? Number 3, rent the scam. Brandy Horn had a great business going for her. She would rent designer items from rental companies, such as Rent the Runway and Poshmark, and then sell those items online. When the victim companies contacted her to get their items back, she would either dispute the charges or cancel her credit card entirely. By the time she was caught, she had defrauded 3 victim companies of over $820,000. The companies involved tried their best to stop her, but she was far too slippery to be caught. Her accounts were repeatedly reported and flagged, but Brandy didn't care about things like that. She simply created another account and continued her scam. By the time she was caught, she had created hundreds of different accounts just to keep stealing. Once she got the items she wanted, she'd photograph them and post them on e-commerce sites for sale. Sometimes she even used the images that the victim companies had used to advertise the items to begin with. Well, at least she's efficient. Over the course of Brandy's criminal career as a thief of designer items, she snagged at least 1,063 items that she had gotten from rental companies, and she sold them all within 2 years, which means she was renting and selling about 40 items a month. Brandy sure has an incredible work ethic for a thief. To make her sales, she would often remove labels on luxury items. According to the police, the tags of dresses she was selling contained residue on the label. This meant that Brandy most likely removed heat-sensitive tags from the items, like a professional. Brandy was eventually caught and has now been charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, and the interstate transportation of stolen property. She could go to jail for 50 years if convicted. With marketplaces like Mercari and Poshmark becoming more and more popular, it wouldn't be surprising if this sort of scam started increasing in popularity. Number 2, who's actually to blame? Anwar Farid Alam and Yousafzai Fahim Alam basically found an infinite money glitch and used it to make infinite dollars. They discovered that they could post priority mail and pay for $100 insurance coverage, and then they could dispute the mails and would cash out on that $100 insurance payment. The grounds of the dispute was usually that the package they sent had been damaged in some way or that the item was missing. And yes, they could do this endlessly. In fact, by the time they were caught, the brothers had done it over 20,000 times and had defrauded the UPS of over $2 million. To make their story more convincing, the brothers would include fabricated invoices together with photos of goods that weren't actually in the package. A couple of times, the brothers started going to great lengths to obscure their identity. They would use aliases, adopt fake business names, use different addresses, and even get UPS to send their $100 to different post offices in the same area. The gig was a profitable one, and the brothers were able to make bank for 3 years uninterrupted. But one day, the USPS eventually noticed this blatant fraud and tracked the boys down. It's extraordinary that this scam was carried out for 3 years and the system didn't notice until over $2 million in fraudulent claims was paid out. This means that if the brothers had just stolen $1 million, they might have never been found out. Each brother now faces a mandatory maximum maximum of 20 years in prison. However, since they have no prior felony convictions, they might get a light sentence. It's pretty wild that these guys made that much over such a long time through the insurance that you always just say no to at the post office. And who's the dumb one here? The brothers or the US government, who apparently don't have basic system checks in place. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to stay right here for our past release to find out how this guy took advantage of money meant to help the homeless population. Number 1. The self-aware Dine and Dasher. Craig Sharp was way too sharp for his good, as he's now been jailed for over a year for skipping out on hotel and restaurant bills. And that's what he says he wanted. But how did Craig even get into this situation in the first place? Well, it's been a long time coming. According to the police, Craig has a rap sheet going back to 1993, and he has served at least 4 different prison sentences for fraud. However, Craig isn't your regular fraud guy. He doesn't use fake names or fake credit cards. Everything about him is legit. He always gives his right name, right credit card account details, and always has a fun time when enjoying his meals and drinks for free. The only really sneaky thing Craig did was sneak out of the establishments he defrauded when no one was looking, and he became pretty good at this actually. His MO was to go to some restaurant and make friends with all the servers. After that, he would order a bunch of drinks and food and even order for other people, including the staff. This would typically get everyone to let their guards down. And then, when no one was looking, he'd vamoose. Craig did the same thing for hotels as well. After lodging for a night, he'll continue to extend his stay while being best buddies with everyone at the hotel. The hotel employees start warming up to him and start believing his endless excuses of why he's yet to settle his bills. Since it's not strange for people to settle their bills after their stay, they allow Craig to stay for months on end without paying a dime. One time, he ran up a $5,000 hotel bill and then left without paying. The shocking thing was that Craig was almost impossible to catch despite leaving legitimate information and addresses. This was because he sometimes stayed in contact with the businesses and promised them that he would pay in bits and pieces. Of course, he usually didn't come through with that payment, and in the end, the businesses he had defrauded were forced to involve the police. When he was eventually caught, Craig confessed immediately and said that his scams were simply a habit he couldn't kick and were an escape for him. He said he always knew he would be caught. That's why he always left his real details. In fact, he said he hoped he could go to prison, get himself sorted, and come out and restart his life. So that's probably why he turned up to his sentencing with an overnight bag and, strangely enough, a cheerful disposition.
In 2019, Victor Rivera gave himself a raise. He increased his regular salary of $67,000 to a much higher salary of $306,000 per year. Suddenly, Rivera was living a whole different lifestyle. Rivera's most expensive purchase was his house in Stony Point, New York. Stony Point is a small middle-class town outside of New York City. It's not exceedingly wealthy, but offers some upper-class living for those who can afford it. Rivera's Stony Point mansion cost him $780,000. The castle-like home featured a heated pool, a waterfall, and a 3-car garage. He also purchased a 4-bedroom house in the Poconos Mountains in Pennsylvania. The region is famous for its rolling green mountains and hills. Average Northeasterners vacation there. Wealthy Northeasterners own mountain homes. Robert E. Kittner, former president of ABC and NBC, owns a house in the Poconos. So does former NFL running back James Monroe and the inventor of the heart-shaped bathtub, Morris Wilkins. When he needed a break from running the Bronx network, Rivera and Lynette drove his Mercedes E-Class up to their house in Poconos. If they didn't feel like driving far, they'd go to Stony Point. The Mercedes, which usually retails at $60,000, was paid for by Rivera's shelters. They classified the expense as a company vehicle. Technically, Rivera was using company money to buy all the items mentioned earlier. He also bought his wife a $2,100 Celine Phantom handbag for her birthday. Lynette was so proud of her gift that she posted about it on Facebook. These purchases were so blatant that everyone could tell the Riveras had money. It was out there for everyone to see, and many people, including a few counselors, knew about Rivera's bizarre spending habits. Nevertheless, Rivera thought he could get away with his lavish spending because of his consultancy businesses. The New York Times published a detailed piece on Victor Rivera in February of 2021. The piece sent shockwaves through New York City as its residents read the horrifying truth about the supposed do-gooder. Victor Rivera. The Times accused Rivera of taking funds from Bronx Network and spending them on personal luxuries. However, their primary accusation, backed up by witness testimonies, was that Rivera had mistreated several of his homeless female tenants. In less than a week, Rivera's life accomplishments came unraveled. He stepped down from Bronx Network, knowing he'd be going to court to face his crimes. However, he wouldn't be legally punished for the mistreatment allegations. The allegations may have destroyed Rivera's reputation, but the financial crimes put him in cuffs. Victor Rivera founded the Bronx Parent Housing Network in 2000. The network focused on housing homeless people suffering on the streets, paving the humble beginning of Rivera's empire. In 2013, the homeless population in New York skyrocketed. Then Mayor Bill de Blasio had to solve a seemingly impossible crisis. He immediately pledged to revitalize the shelter system, which he indeed followed through with. In 2017, de Blasio announced that the city would aim to build 90 shelters in the coming years. This was good news for Rivera. He quickly applied for de Blasio's shelter revitalization project, hoping he'd be accepted. The Bronx Network was accepted and received excessive public funding, so much so that Rivera's place in New York society changed overnight. Rivera and his wife Lynette, who was also involved in the homeless shelter business, rubbed shoulders with some of the most important bureaucrats. They met these bureaucrats at local charity functions. Rivera and his wife dined with city councilmen and other officials. He even hosted a campaign fundraiser for New York City Councilman Richie Torres, who would later earn a seat in Congress. Rivera had come a long way from a homeless addict wandering the South Bronx. On the surface, he was happily married. He owned a thriving and fulfilling business, and as a bonus, he knew a congressman. It was more than he could have ever imagined, but it wasn't meant to last. Victor Rivera was once the esteemed and proud person who ran 70 homeless shelters and soup kitchens in New York City. Now, he's a convicted felon after pleading guilty to fraud. Rivera provides most of the details about his early life through interviews. In fact, he loved telling everyone from reporters to podcasters about his rags to riches story. Rivera usually starts his story off with his early childhood, how he grew up in the South Bronx. At age 9, he started selling in his neighborhood streets to make ends meet. However, he sold illegal things for a reason. He wanted to avoid going back to a homeless shelter. This survivalist attitude helped Rivera develop a knack for business. For example, Rivera bought 2 cars before he turned 15. However, he fathered his first child at 15, blaming a drug addiction for his poor choices. Eventually, Rivera's addiction consumed his life and illegal dealing business. It all added up, and Rivera couldn't pay his rent and was forced to live on the streets. He hadn't been homeless since he was a kid. Rivera was arrested one day when an NYPD officer discovered drugs on his person. He spent 1989 and 1990 behind bars after taking drugs while on probation. Rivera's time in prison changed him, he says. Upon his release, Rivera vowed to change his lifestyle and beat his drug addiction. He started working with a low-income housing project in New York for drug addicts. The recovering addict found purpose and drive while working with people struggling with the same things he was. By 2000, Rivera had cleaned himself up, but instead of joining the workforce, Rivera wanted to honor the people who helped him. He did so by starting his own shelter. Bronx Network got off to a rocky start. Rivera struggled to find any public or private funding for most of the 2000s. However, Rivera's fortunes drastically changed in 2012. The year Bill de Blasio was elected mayor of New York. Victor Rivera, according to his tax filings, made $67,000 in 2012. And Bronx Network only brought in $1.1 million in funding revenue. But then, things quickly changed in 2013. Rivera was arrested in March of 2021 by a squad of NYPD officers in New York. The Times wrote a few more articles on Rivera, following his every moment. They kept their eyes on him between his arrest, imprisonment, and courtroom appearances. The media had a field day with Rivera. He was one of the most prominent shelter owners in New York. His downfall wasn't only just a juicy story, but a huge blow to New York City. At the time of his arrest, Rivera owned 70 homeless shelters and soup kitchens. Suddenly, all these shelters were confiscated from Rivera after he resigned from Bronx Network. The collapse of the Bronx Network allowed investigators to dig deeper into Rivera's scam, showing them and the public who revered him and how corrupt the shelter emperor truly was. Rivera set up a system that benefited him far more than his homeless tenants, and it all started with public funding. According to records, U.S. Congressman Richie Torres was Rivera's primary fund provider. He helped Rivera obtain at least $1 million in public funds via grants from NYC City Council. These grants are awarded to the council's favorite nonprofit organizations, which, thanks to Torres, was usually the Bronx Housing Network. However, Torres and other local officials didn't vote for Rivera's company out of the sheer goodness of their hearts. From 2010 to 2020, Rivera and his wife donated $35,000 to various local officials, according to campaign finance records. Most of that sum funneled into Torres's campaign, given he was the most powerful and influential politician running at the time. Torres released a public statement after the Times piece. He completely ignored the allegations that Rivera had bribed him for public funds. Instead, the newly elected congressman relied on city agencies to vet shelter providers. He never mentioned Rivera, nor did he bring up the Bronx Network. On the other hand, the numbers don't ignore the fact that Torres disproportionately funded the Bronx Network. Rivera's housing company received $274 million in public funding from 2000 to 2020. However, Rivera pocketed most of the money during the 2010s. Rivera owned a consulting business among other entities. However, these entities were only legit on paper. In reality, Rivera was using his consultancy company to clean his dirty public funding money. Financial records show that Rivera paid his consultancy company for services using public funds. The Bronx Network was making some big bucks in its heyday. They brought in $80 million a year from public contractors. So Rivera was able to send big chunks of money to himself without compromising the Bronx Network. The consultancy, however, wasn't owned by Rivera, on paper at least. Rivera controlled the companies, but put them under a family member's name. He figured that investigators looking into his financial transactions would only see friendly family-to-family business investments. For the most part, Rivera was right. Hardly anyone noticed what he was doing with their tax money. Then, a few brave ex-tenants and employees came forward and told the truth. Former Bronx Network employee Danielle Dawson received $45,000 from Rivera in November of 2017. The money was given to her for one purpose: to make her stop talking. And she wasn't the only one. From 2017 to 2019, Rivera paid two women a combined $175,000. They'd accused Rivera of coercing them into performing highly inappropriate acts. Rivera expected women to do what he wanted at this point in his career. The women he exploited were always under his control in one way or another. Women like Danielle worked for Rivera. They depended on his employment for their livelihood. His other accusers suffered from an even more imbalanced power dichotomy. In 2016, Erica Schuyler was lucky enough to obtain a room at Rivera's apartment complex. Rivera lived there, but also used the complex as a homeless shelter. Erica recalls being grateful to finally get off the streets of New York. It was winter, and living outside was especially difficult and dangerous. In December 2016, Rivera asked to inspect her room. He claimed that someone said there was a leaky ceiling in Erica's bedroom, but in reality, there wasn't a leak. Erica says Rivera turned off the lights in her bedroom and took advantage of her. Initially, Erica didn't know what to do. She says Rivera threatened to evict her if she didn't do what he said. Erica obeyed him for the time being. She still needed a place to stay after all. However, Erica says she couldn't allow Rivera to get away with mistreating her or any future women who stay at his shelters. After leaving the shelter, Erica reported Rivera to the Times. All in all, 10 women, including Erica, came forward to testify against Rivera. Women like Danielle Dawson allowed the Times access to their horrific stories. Their stories helped bring attention to Rivera, and all this attention brought in the authorities. New York prosecutors accepted Rivera's guilty plea. He pled guilty to money laundering, honest service fraud, and honest services fraud conspiracy. Each count carries a 20-year maximum sentence. His sentencing is set for May 6, 2022.
Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section what you would pick if you had to. Have only cold food for the rest of your life, or drink room temperature beverages for the rest of your life.